This is a tutorial that I want to walk you through on the comparison and contrast essay for the AP World History class. My hope is this is really going to help you by giving some really specific examples and specific advice to really help you in developing your essays and making sure that you don't fall into some of the traps that a lot of students oftentimes fall into. And this is just because a lot of the skills that we're asking you to do are really tough things. These are pretty abstract. And I know a lot of times when you're going through this, it can seem like these skills appear to be very fuzzy and very difficult to apply. So I'm hoping that with this explanation and with some of these specific examples, it'll make it a little bit clearer for you on what you're supposed to do in the comparison and contrast essay. So first off, I want to start off with the thesis. Remember what we talked about in class. It's really important that you go directly to the thesis in your introduction and don't worry about providing a whole introductory paragraph. There's nothing in the rubric about an introductory paragraph, so this wastes your time or it wastes your space. So in your thesis, you're going to do the following things, and these are the guidelines I want you to do. First off, the thesis should act like an introductory paragraph, so you're going to indent, and then you're going to provide 2 to 3 sentences that directly answer the question or writing prompt. You must make sure that you address the main impacts of the question. So as you're reading the question, look to see what they're asking about. What are the specific effects or impacts that are really important? Next up, make sure you provide one sentence that's a direct comparison, one sentence that's a direct contrast, and then you want a third sentence that states the significance to the thesis statement. A lot of times the way you can do that is to talk about what the long-term impact is of this particular argument. So we'll take a look at some examples. Let's look off of the prompt that we started with at the beginning of the year. Compare and contrast the goals and outcomes of the Chinese and Mexican revolutions in the 20th century. Now here's a poor example of a thesis statement that I wouldn't want you to do, and I want to talk about why it's a poor example. The Mexican and Chinese revolutions differed in multiple ways politically, economically, and socially. Both revolutions attempted to free the people from injustices. This led to major political changes in the 20th century. Now, I'm sure this looks like a really good thesis on its surface. It's establishing a broad argument that you can provide a lot of evidence and a lot of minor arguments under. But here's why it really isn't a very good example of a thesis statement and why I want you to stay away from this trap. Let's look at the first sentence. The Mexican and Chinese revolutions differed in multiple ways. Okay, fine. Now we're looking to see what these multiple ways are. And all we're given is politically, economically, and socially. Well, every society has politics, economics, and social relationships. So it's really hard to tell. These are very vague terms. And typically, these are written into prompts, political, economic, social. So it's almost a repetition of the question itself. You always want to make sure that you modify terms like this, political, economic, and social, or don't state them at all. By modify, here's what I mean. Provide adjectives. Provide something specific that tells me what you mean by political, economic, and social. Let's look at the next sentence. Both revolutions attempted to free the people from injustices. There are a lot of problems here. On the surface, this looks really good. But when you really look into it, it's very vague. It's very general. At least you have here both revolutions, but attempted to free the people. What do we mean by free the people? It sounds like a very cliche kind of argument. I know you might be saying, well, that's kind of being picky. That's really unfair. But if you think about this, freedom can mean a lot of different things. Are we talking about freedom from political oppression, religious oppression? Is this freedom from economic dependency? We really don't know. And all we're provided with after this is this term injustice. Injustice is a vague moral term that we really don't understand what we're talking about. Politics, economics, religious oppression, ethnic oppression, we don't know. Then we end up with this last major statement. This led to major political changes in the 20th century. Okay, this is going to be something I'm going to make a big deal out of in this tutorial. We never want to refer to an issue. We want to state the issue. Here we're referencing an issue. We're not stating an issue. This led to major political changes. Well, what political changes? Now, again, I know you might feel like this is really being nitpicky. You might be saying, hey, Zucker, come on. Really? Seriously? It's about political changes. I'm going to talk about this in my essay. But the problem is political changes can be so vast, so broad, that I really don't know specifically what you're aiming for. And yeah, it's true that you're going to talk about it in the essay, but the point of a thesis is to narrow the ground and tell me what's going to be the major issue you're going to talk about in the essay. So this is just way too broad. It's referencing. It's not giving me specifics. So what would a good example look like? Because remember, we don't want to get factual in our example, but we don't want to get too broad either. Here's a good example. The Mexican Revolution primarily attempted to free the farmers from foreign control of investments, while the Chinese Revolution primarily aimed to move farmers into industrial centers. Both revolutions aimed to free farmers from unequal land distribution. This led to both countries adopting industrial economies that interacted globally with trade. Okay, I want you to see why this ends up being such a good example. First off, it's really important. Notice that in the contrast, we've mentioned both societies, Mexican Revolution and Chinese Revolution. There's a direct contrast. We have direct statements. So we're not going to give anything to be vague. But then look at what we do next. Remember how we talked about earlier that using the term economics is just too vague? Well, we're talking about economics here, but look at what I do here with the economics, or the student who wrote this. The Mexican Revolution primarily attempted to free the farmers from foreign control of investments. Here we're given something very specific, but it's not factual. We can operate with a lot of things underneath this economic issue that we brought up, but we're not getting so overly specific that it becomes only about one particular issue. The Chinese Revolution primarily aimed to move farmers into industrial centers. Notice there's a direct contrast. Foreign control of investments is economic, farmers into industrial centers is economic. We have a direct contrast on a very specific issue. Both revolutions aimed to free farmers from unequal land distribution. Again, economic issue, but it's very specific. We know what we're talking about here. We're not leaving this up to the creativity of who's reading. And then last up, this led to both countries adopting industrial economies that interacted globally with trade. Notice there's a significant statement, long-term impact, very specific but not factual. This is the kind of good example I want you to use when you're writing your thesis statement. So what can we take out of this? For future thesis statements, because you're probably never going to see this question again, what you can take out of this is this. Number one, make sure that you provide both societies and they need to be stated in the thesis. Number two, you really need to make sure you address all parts of the question. In this particular case, the question asks goals and outcomes. You've got to make sure that you address both of those. Third up, make sure that you modify and make specific statements about these general terms. And lastly, make sure your significant statement is specific and gives a long-term impact. Body paragraphs. When you write your body paragraphs, here's the general model that I've suggested. Your topic sentence should be a specific and direct comparison or contrast statement. After that, you want to use the rule of three specific pieces of evidence. And we talked about this before. When I say rule of three, it's probably a bad way of saying that. It's more like a guideline of three. If you have a body paragraph that has only 2 specific examples, that's fine. As long as you're hitting overall that minimum of 5 examples for the essay, and then we want to try and go over that. So trying to hit 3 is a good idea. And the last step, an analysis statement. This is really important. We're going to come back to this because it's really significant. An analysis statement is a statement about why the countries or issues we're comparing and contrasting are the same or different. Okay, I'm going to make a big deal about this because a lot of people are making mistakes about what analysis means. Again, analysis is about why. Why is this happening? And I'll show you some examples in a few minutes to demonstrate that. Direct comparison and contrast. First off, you want to make sure that you have the very first sentence, topic sentence of your paragraph, should be a direct comparison or contrast. Make sure it's this one sentence, and it's one sentence at the beginning of the paragraph. Don't make this into 2 or 3 sentences. The reason why is if you start to do that, it looks like a parallel comparison or contrast within a paragraph. Make it one sentence, first sentence of the paragraph. It needs to be direct and comparing and contrasting the same issue. A lot of times what students make a mistake on is that they do comparison or contrast. They'll say, both countries did X, or they'll say, while this one country did this, the other country did the other thing. But the two things they're talking about are completely separate issues. You've got to make sure that the issues are exactly the same types of issues that you're comparing and contrasting. Next up, and this is really big, and I can't keep saying this enough, don't refer to an issue. Make a direct argument. Never just say, we're going to talk about some kind of issue. Tell me what the issue is that you're going to talk about. And then last up, the issue has to be significant. Well, how do you know that the issue is significant? Tie it back to the prompt's question. So for example, like in this one, this particular question asked about goals and outcomes of these 2 revolutions. A lot of people talked about things like one leader in one society was very charismatic. The other leader was not. Well, that's fine, and that's true. That is a contrast. But that's not about the question. The question is asking about goals and outcomes. So we want to make sure that whatever we come up with is significant because it's tying back to those issues. Tie it back to the issues that are in the prompt itself. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. I'm going to give you 2 poor examples that were used for comparison and contrast statements. Poor example of a comparison statement. Both revolutions were similar because of the goals they wanted. Okay, perfect example of a vague comparison statement that is referring. It is not stating it directly. I don't know if you guys can see this, but take a look at how this is a reference, not a direct statement. Both revolutions were similar. Okay, that's fine. Because the goals they wanted. Okay, what goals are we talking about? This refers to the goals that you're going to talk about later on in your body paragraph. It's probably all going to be there, but it's not stating what those goals are in the argument. You got to make sure you do that. So stay away from referencing. It's really vague. Poor example of a contrast statement. Mexico wanted a strong leader, but China wanted to industrialize. Okay, tons of things that are really problematic about this contrast statement. At least they have Mexico and China in here. That's good. But take a look at what's happening here. Mexico wanted a strong leader. Okay, is that really about goals and outcomes? Is that really significant to what the question's asking? But here's even another problem that's a problem here. Mexico wanted a strong leader. China wanted to industrialize. True. This is a contrast. It's set up as a contrast. But how is leader versus industrialization a true direct contrast? Those are two separate issues. Strong leader is about politics. Industrialization is about economics. You don't want to do this. You want to make sure you have similar issues that you're comparing or contrasting. So here's a good example of a comparison statement. Both the Chinese and Mexican revolutions attempted to free their societies from foreign intervention and control. Okay, notice here, this is not referencing. We're getting directly to the issue, foreign intervention and control. You can go on your body paragraph and get plenty of examples of this. You can talk about how the U.S. and Mexico had huge influence over oil companies. You can talk about how in China, Britain had huge influence through the Opium Wars. Or you could talk about how the open door policy at the end of the 1800s had a big influence on China. So you can use a lot of examples in your body paragraphs, but at least instead of referring, you're directing me to what you're going to talk about inside of this body paragraph. Here's a good example of a contrast topic sentence. Although Mexico's main goal was to free itself from foreign intervention in oil, China's main goal is to move peasant farmers to industrial centers to break down economic inequality. Take a look at what this does. I have a specific statement, Mexico and China, specifically contrasting. I've given a specific issue, foreign intervention in oil versus peasant farmers moving into industrial centers to break down economic inequality. Both are economic. Both are being contrasted. This is a very direct contrasting statement. This is what you need to give at the beginning of your topic sentences. So what do we take out of this that's really important? Number one, please make sure to take this down. Don't forget this. You do not want to refer to issues. You want to state what the issue is. True, you don't want to provide something that's too narrow and too factual, but notice what we've been able to do in those good examples. You can use a broad concept that allows us to know what we're going to talk about in the body paragraph without being too narrow. Okay, the other big thing, always make sure in a contrast sentence you want to use both societies, Chinese and Mexican revolutions, so that we know exactly what we're contrasting. And last up, make sure that the issues you're contrasting are similar issues that need to be contrasted. Don't contrast things just because you can contrast. They need to be contrasted because they're of the same types of items that we can contrast. Economic versus economic, political versus political, social versus social. Analysis statements. Okay, this is a really tough one. Don't feel bad about this. A lot of people struggle with this. And I think it's because the concept of analysis, while it sounds simple on its surface, really isn't. It's a very difficult thing that you have to do. In fact, it's probably the biggest thing we do in history, right? Analysis statements are about the reason why things happen. So we're looking at why do countries have similar or different patterns. Analysis is not about long-term effects. Analysis is not about evaluations or moral judgments. Analysis, in the end, is an explanation about why. Why do things happen in two societies? And that's what we're looking to provide at the end of our body paragraphs. We want to provide that analysis that says, look, we've talked about what the comparison is, we've talked about the contrast, here's my evidence, here's the reason why. One last thing, take this down, don't forget this, because I'm going to be really tough on you guys in the future as far as grading goes on this one. You cannot just repeat your topic sentence in your analysis statement. That's repetitive. That's not really giving me a good reason. You need to separate out those two things. Topic sentence tells me what you're comparing and contrasting. Analysis at the end tells me why. Don't be repetitive. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. So I'm going to give you this time around a poor example, and then we're going to fix it up right afterwards to see how you can make this a little bit better. Poor example of analysis. Mexico and China's move to industrialization has led to their current economic success in the global markets. Okay, there's some really good things about this. One, both societies are there. Two, this is very specific. This is not referencing. This is really specific. So why is this a problem? Because there's no reason why this is happening. All we're getting given is a long-term effect. Notice this isn't analysis. This is about impacts. So what would be a good example of analysis here? How can we fix this up? Both Mexico and China have succeeded because They adopted world trade and strengthened their domestic skills in manufacturing industries. Now notice it's very similar to the previous statement. We're saying long term, both societies have done well, but we're given a reason why. There's a because statement here. In fact, I'm going to really strongly suggest this. And I want you to really take this to heart and really consider this. Maybe what you need to do at the end of every single body paragraph is use that word because. Okay? Sure, it's going to be formulaic, it's going to be repetitive, whatever. I can't take away points from you for doing that. There is nothing in the AP World History rubric that says I have to take away points because you use the word because over and over again. Okay, there's nothing that's there that allows me to do that. So use that word. If you're unsure about how to do this, know this is a tough skill. It's tough to figure this out. Really good writers eventually figure out how to do this without having to use the word, but hey, we're all learning here. There's nothing wrong with that. So use the word until this feels comfortable and you feel like you can go without using it. And by the way, even if you do use it and you feel like, hey, you know, not sure if this makes me a good writer or not, it really doesn't matter. This is going to trigger for your reader, whether it's me grading or the AP graders at the end of the year. They're going to see that word because and they're going to know what you are doing. Why not do that for now? Makes perfect sense to do that, and then you can build on that skill. Okay, another poor example of analysis. Mexican attempts to free themselves from clerical control was different from Chinese motives because they had different circumstances. Okay, by now, hopefully you're getting what the problem is here because we've talked about this several times. This is referencing, right? We really don't know what they mean by different circumstances. We want to make that specific. So here's a good example of how we can fix that up. While China did not worry about religious control, Mexico did attempt to free itself from clerical authority because the Mexican leaders adopted new ideas of science and technology. Remember, this gets back to how the Mexican leaders were those people called positivists who wanted to use science and technology in order to create progress. Notice what we're saying here. China didn't have to worry about that kind of religious control because it was a traditional society, but Mexico did have to worry about that because it was trying to move into this new scientific and technological era. So we have a very specific point. It's not being referenced. We know what the reason is. This is not about long-term effects, although it refers to that. It's giving us a specific reason for why situations are different in both countries. Some final thoughts. Be careful of parallel comparisons and contrasts. Most of you guys are actually doing fine on this. You didn't make that mistake of doing like one paragraph being a comparison where you just state something about Mexico and then the next one being about China, and then you kind of imply that there's a comparison. That's good. But here's where the problem did come up. A lot of people did parallel comparisons and contrasts in the body paragraphs. How did they do that? They made a statement about Mexico in the first sentence, made a statement about China in the second sentence, and there's nothing to connect it together. So how do you avoid this? You avoid it by making sure the comparison and contrast statements only go in the first sentence, okay? Don't make vague statements that refer to an issue. State the issue. Okay, we've given a lot of examples of this. Stay away from doing this. Don't refer to something you will talk about. Give me a specific argument about what you are going to talk about. Make sure all arguments connect back to the thesis and prompt. This is really important. You know, when you make arguments, even if you set it up as a comparison or contrast, that doesn't mean that it's a valid comparison or contrast. Valid comparisons and contrasts must make sure that they're significant. How do you know if they're significant? They have to connect back to what the prompt is asking. So in this case, the prompt is asking about goals and outcomes. So make sure all of your arguments connect back to goals and outcomes. And then last up, this is a really big issue, and I mentioned it earlier, but I want to make a big issue out of it again. Don't use vague words like political, economic, or social. These are very vague. They're repetitive of words within the prompt a lot of times, and they can easily be made into more specific things. Modify them. How do you modify them? What do I mean by that? Use adjectives. So go back in this tutorial and you'll see how we did that. We took words like political, economic, or social, and we attached things to them like foreign investment or industrialization or clerical control. And by doing that, it gives a much more specific understanding about what you mean about these terms. Okay, so those are the big things I want you to start fixing up in your comparison and contrast essays. Hopefully by giving you these examples, it makes it a lot more clear for you guys. We've got to make sure that at the beginning of the year, as you guys are taking this home and practicing it, that you get these things down, because eventually we're going to have to do this under time pressure, and that's when it's going to become really tough. So we want to make sure that we get these skills down. Good luck. Send me emails with rough drafts, and I'm hoping that this is going to start looking really good. You guys are smart guys, so I know you guys can do this well. It's just a matter of practicing this. See you guys in class.